Elite Facts presents
7 of the wildest parties in history.
7.
The Field of Golden Cloth. It's probably no surprise that kings like to show off at their parties. They have the wealth of entire nations to spend, and it should probably come as no surprise then that 2 kings trying to outdo each other at a party would end up ludicrously lavish. Diplomacy is often best done with a bit of booze to drink, and usually some sports for entertainment. At least Tudor-era diplomacy was, and was not unlike 2 college bros talking out their problems over a few cans and watching football, only replace football with jousting and tourney melees. In 1520, Henry VIII decided to forge an alliance with Francis I of France, and the two threw a great party that became known as the Field of Golden Cloth to facilitate their negotiations. Obviously, the budget for the party was the national treasuries of 2 of the most powerful nations of the time, so things only got extravagant. The event earned its name because most of the tents and a lot of the clothing were made out of golden cloth. There was a temporary structure of brick and tentage built like a palace that covered some 12,000 square yards, complete with a courtyard and fountains filled with wine. The event's entertainment included jousting, archery, and the best music the era had to offer. As with so many parties, someone always ruins the fun by starting a fight that makes it awkward for everyone. King Henry, riding a height of success and testosterone from the previous events, grabbed King Francis by the collar and challenged him to a wrestling match. King Henry lost and, feeling rather grumpy-like about defeat, called the whole party off and went home with bitter feelings towards Francis. Henry then made an alliance with France's rival, Charles V of Spain, and war later ensued. So much for strengthening relationships.
6.
The inaugural games of the Colosseum. The Roman Colosseum, the great stadium of gladiatorial combat in Rome. You're probably well aware that it was built to play host to fights between gladiators for the amusement of the masses of Rome, and that things could get rather violent and bloody. But you might not be aware of just how wild things got when the Colosseum was first opened. To start with, when the Colosseum opened, the city of Rome ground to a halt as everyone began a 100-day-long drunken celebration of gratuitous violence, probably only stopping for the occasional orgy. Not something many people would do today at a party, but they sacrificed over 9,000 animals in celebration, many of them exotic ones too. It was a good time to be a winemaker, but a bad one to be a goat. It's estimated that 2,000 gladiators died in these opening games, and that's not counting those who died in the Numancia. Clearly wanting to honor his father's vision, Emperor Titus went all out on opening the Colosseum and even commissioned 2 Numancia. These were mock naval battles that saw the arena of the Colosseum flooded with actual battleships being built inside the Colosseum beforehand. Armies of thousands of gladiators fought it out on the decks of these ships, and many died in the process.
5.
Andrew Jackson's White House parties. Recent U.S. presidents are currently a bit lacking on the wild party front. At the very best, there was Obama's Halloween parties, which were rather tame. President Trump may have significant personal wealth, but is so far yet to throw any extravagant White House parties. The 7th President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, earned a bit of a reputation for wild White House parties during his time in office. When Jackson assumed office in 1825, his first act was to throw a huge celebration. More than 20,000 people turned up at the White House for the party, and the crowd got so rowdy that the president was forced to sneak out of a window. Jackson couldn't get back inside his presidential home until some decided the best way to get the drunks out of the White House was to put tubs of whiskey on the lawn. Jackson had clearly started as he had meant to finish, because his leaving the party was even wilder. In the run-up to Obama's exit from the White House, you may have seen all those memes of Joe Biden trying to convince Obama to troll Trump upon moving into the White House, changing all the locks, painting Mexican flag in the Oval Office, that sort of thing. But Andrew Jackson ended up inadvertently doing just that for the incoming president, Martin Van Buren. In 1835, Jackson was gifted a 1,400-pound wheel of cheese by Colonel Thomas Meacham of New York, presumably because Amazon gift cards weren't yet a thing in the 19th century. The The president must have somehow forgotten about the massive wheel of cheese because it was left to ferment for over a year before he put out an advertisement inviting the entire country to come and feast on his cheese. Over 10,000 citizens turned up for a bit of cheese, and the crowd devoured all of it in 2 hours. The cheese could apparently be smelled over half a mile away in every direction, and the White House stunk of cheese for weeks later after Andrew Jackson left.
4.
The signing of the U.S. Constitution. On the subject of American democracy and partying, it would be foolish to ignore the celebrations that ensued around the signing of the U.S. Constitution. After 5 months of some harsh brain-racking about freedom and democracy, the Founding Fathers of the United States were more than ready to let loose once the Constitution was all written up and signed off. In fact, they were so ready they let loose 2 days before they actually signed it. At a tavern in Philadelphia, all 55 delegates to the signing turned up for a night of wild, destructive drunkenness. 4 Founding Fathers were in attendance: George Washing It Down, Ben White Lightning Franklin, Alexander Not Throwing Away His Shots Hamilton, and James $5,000 Bill of Drinking Rights Madison. How drunk a party was it? Well, the bar tab for the night says they got through 12 bottles of beer, 8 bottles of hard cider, 22 bottles of porter, 8 bottles of whiskey, 7 bowls of alcoholic punch, and 104 bottles of wine. The barkeep even added an extra 2% onto the final bill to cover the damage done to property by the statesman, which included broken tables and broken chamber pots. Creating the foundations for a new nation must really be stressful work if that's the kind of party needed to unwind afterwards. It's a wonder how their livers survived the night, or how it is they broke so many chamber pots.
3.
The capture of Persepolis. Ever get so drunk you burn down a capital city? No? Well, Alexander the Great and his army did. You're probably aware the ancient Greeks had some beef with the Persians. 300 Spartans famously held off a Persian advance on Athens, but Athens still ended up a burned-out ruin. No one is quite sure as to how Athens burned, but the Greeks blamed the Persians and it lasted in their memory. By the time Alexander of Macedon was leading his Greco-Macedonian army against the Achaemenid Empire of Persia, Alexander's soldiers were ready for some R&R and R, rest, relaxation, and revenge. When Alexander's armies finally took the Persian capital Persepolis, things got wild. They had what is referred to as a symposium. These days, the word refers to a sort of conference or seminar. In those days, it referred to much the same, only with more alcohol, feasting, and sex. Alexander's soldiers were allegedly emotional drunks, and after discussing the animosity between Greece and Persia with a drunken whore, Alexander declared, "Why do we not avenge Greece then and put the city to the torch?" Alexander then led his men on a rather literal drunken orgy of destruction through the city, all on the advice of a prostitute. Alexander even did this all to music, which was played as his men sacked the city. The next morning, while presumably very well hung over, Alexander was apparently very embarrassed at seeing all the destruction he had caused.
2.
Moscow Victory Day, 1945. May 9, 1945 was officially declared Victory Day in Russia after the defeat of Nazi Germany, and went down in history as the day Moscow ran out of vodka. At 1:10 a.m., an official invitation to a party was announced on the radio by the chief announcer of Radio Moscow. What ensued next was one of history's biggest parties. Given all that Russia had suffered in the war with Germany and the siege Moscow had been under, it is unsurprising that the population was itching for a drunken hootenanny. Thousands of people quickly took to the streets of the Russian capital and got drinking, some still wearing their PJs. Moscow, one of the largest cities in the world, was described as having turned into a sea of vodka. Muscovites ended up going on a bar crawl past all the Allied embassies, who naturally joined in with the drinking, bringing their own alcohol reserves to the party. One reporter in Moscow at the time said, quote, "I was lucky to buy a liter of vodka at the train station when I arrived, because it was impossible to buy any later. There was no vodka in Moscow on May 10th. We drank it all." By the time Stalin had given an official address to the nation 22 hours later, the booze reserves of Moscow were dry. That's right, the people of Moscow partied so hard that they ran out of vodka. It might be a bit of a stereotype to say Russians really like their vodka, but the fact they literally drank all of the vodka in Moscow really says something. But who could blame them given what they'd suffered in the war? The mighty collective hangover they surely all suffered the next day was nothing compared to the trauma they'd been through.
1.
Banquet of the Chestnuts. Wild and debauched, two words you probably don't associate with the Vatican City. But as it turns out, they describe the papal orgy of 1501, also known as the Banquet of the Chestnuts, rather well. You may have heard of the Borgias. They were an affluent family, not unlike the Sopranos, in Renaissance Italy. Their influence extended even to the Vatican, as Pope Alexander IV was himself a Borgia patriarch. The Borgias, being the sort of family that they were, might well have been properly into their religion, but they didn't necessarily practice what they preached. Pope Alexander's son and Vatican Cardinal, Cesare Borgia, decided one day to throw his dad a hell of a party in the Apostolic Palace. The evening started with a grand banquet of food and wine, the likes of which had total disregard for the Christian values of modesty and the sin of gluttony. After the feast, the party guests were still very full of energy. Servants came into the banqueting hall and removed the candelabras from the tables and arranged them on the floor. Chestnuts were then strewn all over the floor, and 50 naked dancing prostitutes entered the hall and began to dance for the guests as the Pope watched. According to Pope Alexander's Master of Ceremonies, Johannes Burchard, what happened next was that the naked courtesans crept around the floor on their hands and knees, picking up the chestnuts. The Pope looked on with his son Cesar and his daughter Lucretia. Eventually, the display descended into an orgy, and prizes were announced for those who could perform the act most often with the courtesans. It was reported that Pope Alexander IV himself handed out the awards for those who busted the most chestnuts.
Don't forget to like us and subscribe for more elite facts.